Hi, I'm Sheriff William H. Houston. I have done more to clean up the West than any other man. I have hung 5 men, shot 1 down in the street, and sent over 100 down the road to the penitentiary where they belonged. May 7th, 1853, I was born in Logansport, Indiana. I was too young to serve in the Civil War, but I had 4 brothers that served in the Civil War in the Union Army. Didn't have much opportunity for a formal education, so I learned through the School of Hard Knocks and experience. When I was old enough to leave the family farm, I did so. In 1875, I was cold, I was destitute, I was hungry, and I was in rags. I met a character that you guys might all have heard about, Wild Bill Hickok. He took me under his protective wing and he got me a job as a guard on the stagecoach between Deadwood, South Dakota and Cheyenne, Wyoming. And part of my job description on that was to ride on top of the stagecoach with shotguns and revolvers. At the first sign of trouble, I was to shoot to kill and worry about it later. At the end of the stagecoach era, I joined the railroad as a brakeman. And I worked in Oklahoma, the Wabash Road, and in Texas as a brakeman, and I worked my way up to conductor. In 1883, when the Northern Pacific came to Missoula, Montana, I moved up to Missoula, Montana, and I rented the Grand Central Motel. And I ran that motel for 2 years. And at the end of those 2 years, the Northern Pacific asked me to be a conductor on the railroad again. And I took that job and I held that job until I was elected sheriff in 1889. I was also elected as a city alderman for 2 years in 1887, and I served in that position also. In 1889, Montana became a state, and I was the first elected sheriff of Missoula County in the newly formed state of Montana. And one of the first jobs I had to do was to run down 4 Indian renegades. But it didn't take me long to realize that the renegade problem probably started in 1870 with the Eugene Baker massacre up on the Marias River. In that case, Eugene Baker rode into a pagan camp of Indians and he murdered 150 men, women, and children. There's a lot of hostility and anger over this particular incident. So much so that the Indians would strike out, or white people would just see the Indians and they would strike out. But regardless of the conflict between the Indians and the whites, it was always assumed that the Indians were the aggressor. And we'd send out troops and posse to go find the Indians and we'd execute them or bring them back for trial. But in this case, we do have 4 known murderers. The first one was Pascal, and I went after him, and I took a posse of 80 men on a train up to Ravalli, Montana. And after we got to Ravalli, Montana, we got off the train, and we rode to Chief Inez's camp, who was protecting Pascal. And I rode into camp with the armed men, and he was upset that armed people came onto the reservation without his permission, and he confronted me with a rifle in his arms. And I said, "I'm looking for Pascal. He murdered a man by the name of Dunn up by Plains, Montana. I want to get him." And Chief Inez says, "Well, go get him." Now I knew in those times that if I tried to ride through the reservation with 80 armed men, that the Indians would protect him and I'd never find Pascal. So I did what was common practice in Montana and Wyoming at the time. I kidnapped the chief and held him hostage. I said, "As soon as you bring me back Pascal, I will turn the chief over to you." I took him out onto a boat and I held him on the Flathead Lake. The Indians shot at me during the night, but the next morning, the Braves came in with Pascal tied to a pony. They turned over Pascal, I turned over the chief. But before I left, I did one wise thing. I gave the chief a brand new revolver, and I gave all the sub-chiefs gifts too. And I took Pascal down to jail in Missoula, Montana. And this good gesture of giving gifts is going to come back and pay dividends later on. Because now I have to go after Pierre Paul, who is a giant of an Indian. He's 6 feet 4 inches tall, and he has a little friend, Lala C. They murdered 2 people that were camped along the railroad tracks up by Thompson Falls. And they murdered them just for the fun of it. They claimed it was revenge. I go up there to Chief Inez's camp, and I go by myself. And this time I'm armed with 2 bottles of whiskey. And we negotiate, because we're friends, because I gave him a gun, and we remain lifelong friends. We negotiate over a couple of swigs of good whiskey, and Chief Inez decides that he will send some Braves after Pierre Paul and Lala C for me. The Braves go up there and they find him, and they're able to overpower Pierre Paul, but Lala C makes his escape. And the Braves bring him back tied up to a pony, and they turn him over to me, but they're afraid that there's going to be revenge. The chief promises that there'll be no tribal revenge against the braves that brought these guys in. Lala C roams around the reservation for 2 or 3 days, and after that time he turns himself into Duncan McDonald, who is a trusted trader with the Flathead Indians and the Kootenai Indians, and he's stationed up at Fort Koenig, just north of St. Regis. Duncan McDonald rides Lala C down to Missoula, Montana. They're right as friends. They come in to Missoula. Lala C turns himself into me, and I put him in the jail. I now have one other known murderer that I have to go after, and this guy was involved with 6 other Indians, but 2 of them were tracked down and hung by a vigilante committee, and the other 3 were not involved in the murder. But this guy was known to be violent, and they murdered 3 trappers. The Indians believed that this was a revenge killing, so they were protecting him. I put out the word across the county that we're looking for him, and we get reports that he's riding across the country with his horse and the pack horse. We know where he's at, we track him down, we arrest him, we bring him to Missoula, Montana. There are 4 separate trials for these Indians, and all 4 are convicted. And all 4 are sentenced to hang on December 19th, 1890. While they were prisoners in my jail, they were good prisoners, and just before the execution, I did provide them some medicinal medicine to help them fortify themselves before the execution. Okay, it was a little bit of whiskey. On the gallows that was built by Robert Mittman, it was to hang all 4 people at the same time, and there was a stockade built around to keep the looky-loos away too. One of the unique features that was built into this gallows was on the treads. There's a rope following along the treads, and on any one of these treads, a chisel could be put into this that would cut the rope. This rope would then trigger the trap and spring the mechanism for the execution. No one would know which step that was except the guy that put the chisel. What we did is we took all 4 of them up, we put the hoods over their neck and put the ropes over their heads. We had the last rites, we had their last words that were said, and I asked everybody else to get off the stage. After everybody else was off the stage, I did the final adjustments and stuff, and I too was walking off, and I had an assistant underneath the gallows that actually placed a chisel. I didn't know which step that was on, and when I walked out and stepped on it, it was a surprise for everyone. All 4 Indians were promised that they could go back onto the reservation. I made that promise to Peter Ronan and the Indians, and after the execution they were pronounced dead. All 4 of them were taken back up to the reservation and buried. Another case that I had involved a gambling hall in Missoula, Montana that was robbed. The bad guy is running down the street, and a Missoula city policeman is chasing the guy. The bad guy turns around and he shoots the Missoula policeman dead in the street. I'm called and notified, and I'm expected to go chase this guy. I chase this bad guy down the street, and he shoots 3 shots at me. He misses all 3 times. I return fire on all 3 shots. I did not miss. Needless to say, he died in the street. Another case that I had, an individual robbed $5,000 from the Northern Pacific Railroad, and he went down to Mexico. I could not cross the international border to get him, so I hired a Mexican to go across the border and chase him back across the border. Once he got across the border, I arrested him, took him back to Montana. We tried him, convicted him, and I sent him down the road to the prison where he belonged. Another case that I was involved in my first term was there was a major fire in downtown Missoula. And 2 transients, one by the name of John Burns, was using that as cover to ransack and loot the businesses. One of the business owners confronts John Burns, and John Burns shoots this business owner and wounds him. He also continues shooting, and he hits Maurice Higgins and wounds Maurice Higgins, who later dies. Maurice Higgins is Mayor Higgins' son over here. John Burns swims the river, and I was able to stand on the bridge and watch him swim it and see where he's coming. He comes back across, and I come up to him, and I come up behind him with my gun drawn, and I tell him to give up. John Burns raises his hands and turns around and gives up. He made a wise choice. We had the trial. He was convicted. He too was sentenced to hang by the neck until he was dead, which I performed that execution also. One unfortunate thing that did happen in that execution is after he was pronounced dead, he was turned back over to the mortician. And evidently we lost security on him because someone skinned him tanned his hide and turned his hide into moccasins. He could be walking around here now. That was my first term as sheriff of Missoula County. I entered in business deals with C.P. Higgins and Greeno on the Union City Block building, which is a 3-story building with a basement. I believe it's the bank right there on Broadway and Higgins right now. I had other businesses and properties that I invested in wisely. Some of my investments and my wise decisions on investment on property could have been because I was the land commissioner for Missoula. I was also the city police chief for the city of Missoula. At that time, the budget was $20,000. The day I took office, I immediately slashed the budget to $9,000 and provided the same service for the citizens of Missoula that they were getting for the $20,000. I did it by cutting out the graft. I used sound, common sense, and good business practices to run the office. At the end of that 1 year, I turned in $9,400 worth of fines. So in essence, I had a budget of $9,000, turned in $9,400. The city made a profit on the police department that year. Have you ever heard of that? My second term of office, I saw that there was a lot of waste going on in the sheriff's department. And I said, look at my record of cutting budgets and providing good quality service. And I was elected as the sheriff of Missoula for a second time in 1920. 1920 was when Prohibition was going on. And at that time, I got accused of consorting with moonshiners, of incompetence, and actually having deputies manufacturing moonshine. I was kicked out of office after 11 months. I died April 14th, 1937. I died one of the wealthiest citizens of Missoula at the time. My only child, Harvey Houston, is buried right here. My wife, who I married in 1880, Mary, is buried right here, and I don't know who John is. William Houston, I've done as much as any man to clean up the West. I've hung 5 people, shot 1 down in the street, and sent over 100 on their way to the prison.